Hello, everyone. My name is John Villasenor, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Hoover Capital Conversations. Capital Conversations is an ongoing series featuring discussions between those who generate the ideas that enable a free society and those who turn them into actionable policy. We invite you to listen and participate in discussions between our issue experts and policymakers as they consider solutions to some of our most difficult problems. Today, I welcome Congressman Khanna and InfoWorks CEO Buno Pati. As part of the discussion, we'll be taking audience questions and encourage you to submit yours at the Q&A button located at the bottom of the screen. So let's get started with a brief introduction of our guests. So Congressman Khanna represents California's 17th Congressional District, located in the heart of Silicon Valley. Representative Khanna sits on the House Agriculture, Armed Services, and Oversight and Reform Committees, where he chairs the Environmental Subcommittee and is the Deputy Whip of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, serves as the Assistant Whip for the Democratic Caucus, and is the Democratic Vice Chair of the House Caucus on India and Indian Americans. Buno Pati is the CEO of Infoworks.io. The company's software solutions are enabling enterprise organizations to fully leverage their data assets and realize faster time to value in the cloud. Prior to assuming the role of CEO in 2019, he held executive chairman and chairman roles at the company from its inception in 2014. Buno brings over 20 years of experience as a CEO, entrepreneur, board member, and investor in technology companies. He is also a partner at Centerview Capital. So welcome, Congressman Khanna and Buno. I'm excited for today's conversation.
Thank you for doing this.
So with that, we'll start the discussion. So just to frame it a bit, this discussion is going to be focused on data infrastructure, and in particular, the idea of how do we specifically ensure a collection of systems and processes that are in place for delivering the right data at the right time and in the right place. So let me start off with a question that will sort of help frame the discussion in light of COVID, which of course is something we've all been dealing with far too much in the last couple of years. And we've witnessed many examples of data infrastructure potential to minimize the negative impact of COVID outbreaks and improve management and distribution of vaccines. At the same time, I think most people would agree that COVID was something that provided an important example of how we might have benefited from better access to data. So the question is, how can private and public sectors work together to resolve issues with COVID data agility and analytics in a timely manner?
John, I think what we witness is actually the failure of an antiquated data infrastructure to support the urgent needs of policymakers and agencies at a time of national crisis. So when we talk about data infrastructure, the benefits of modern data infrastructure at a national level are enormous. Whether we are responding to crises such as pandemics, large-scale cyber attacks, natural disasters, or simply determining social policy and making operational decisions, timely and trustworthy data is just simply invaluable in assessing a situation and informing our actions and decisions. The pandemic starkly highlighted the need to modernize the federal data infrastructure. So if you take a look at modern data infrastructures, they must, at the very least, at a high level, enable easy and reliable gathering of data, and also make that data easily accessible, deliver the right data to the right place at the right time to those who can leverage it. And that includes government agencies, academia, and private sector. So simply gathering COVID-related data was a tremendous challenge where ultimately, labs had to actually fax and email results. Yes, it's 2022, and I did say fax, right? So last month, Dan Jernigan, who's the CDC's Deputy Director for Public Health, Science, and Surveillance, said that people are spending 80% of their time, 80%, just collating information, taking a fax and putting it into one of their systems. This is simply too antiquated to provide any value in this day and age. So the good news is the technology and automation exist today to solve these problems. The private sector can play an important role in helping the CDC and government as a whole in establishing these modernized systems, because large companies actually suffer from the same issues. They have legacy data infrastructure where there's abundant data silos, but there's no way to readily leverage that data, in their case, to improve customer experience, operations, or decision-making. So there is a tsunami of activity in the corporate world, modernizing corporate data, and this is invaluable information and sort of experience for the public sector as well. So in addition to prioritizing the funding of the effort, the government needs to help establish standards that facilitate the sharing and protection of data, and also direct agencies to implement these standards. The private sector can help by providing the technology and applying learnings and best practices to implement those standards in a modern data infrastructure.
Okay, so if I could turn to you, Congressman Khanna, if obviously there's an enormous amount of data that's out there, some of it generated by private entities. There's local and state governments. There's obviously the federal government. In your view, Representative Khanna, what do you think the best role of the federal government is in either building, supporting, enhancing, creating, encouraging a data infrastructure that's up to the task of the challenges that we have these days?
Well, first thing is we have to ensure people that their data is being protected. One of the big concerns in the country is that people's data has been taken without their knowledge, exploited, and people own the rights to their data. And so I've been advocating for an Internet Bill of Rights to make sure that people consent to the use of their data, that they know what's happening with their data, and that this is a protection both against government overreach and private sector overreach. But then I agree that we need a strong data infrastructure with data that has been consented for use. We want to be able to use it effectively, especially if it's metadata and doesn't have personal information. And we should be looking at building out the infrastructure so that the government isn't one step behind in the use of data, that we are actually using the data effectively to guide decision making. And we should be able to do that because we have access to so much of it. So it would be a shame if we weren't doing it, premised on the fact that we first and foremost protect people's right to their data.
And I guess on that note, Congressman Khanna or Buno or both, there's a federal data strategy and particularly a 2030 vision of the federal data set strategy. And, do we have sufficient data infrastructure to support the progress, to achieve that? Or is that something that we're really not lined up to achieve? Or is there any, what are your thoughts on sort of that, moving toward that as a goal, and how well positioned we are to do that? And potentially relatedly, whether that even assuming we achieve those goals, does that then solve the data infrastructure problems?
We need more investment in data infrastructure, and that is something that hopefully the Competes bill, which is going to be $200 billion in science and technology investment, some of it going to NSF, some of it going to other agencies, that some of that could be used to improve the data infrastructure, some of the grants. But it's obvious to me that we definitely need to continue to improve the data infrastructure capability in the federal government.
So, John, just on that, first of all, have to applaud the foresight and vision that's gone into this federal data strategy. It's a firm recognition of the value of data and data infrastructure at a national level. And what's interesting is this was actually established before the pandemic, and unfortunately, we've all been witness to 2 years of evidence of the importance of such a strategy. So having said that, the answer to the question, do we have enough infrastructure, is definitely no. If we're still faxing data from labs to the CDC, I mean, that certainly speaks for itself.
I'm surprised they're still sending this stuff by fax, but wow, I mean, I guess I didn't know that.
Yeah, so here's something I'll actually read. So you can see this by example. So one of the things in the federal data strategy, one of the key tenets is the ability to share data, share it on a broad basis, right? So that includes government agencies, that includes private sector, academia, shared across the board to people who can leverage that. And that requires a fair amount of infrastructure to be put in place. And as Congressman Khanna just pointed out, you need software systems not only to make the data available, but also to protect it, right? And to share it appropriately. Now, here I'll just read a section from the 2021 FDS, or Federal Data Strategy Action Plan, which, by the way, was only published in October of 2021. This is the 2021 Action Plan. It says, several agencies have created integrated approaches to data analytics and decision support development, infrastructure and tools, etc. Yet there is no strategy for an approach that would provide decision support on common or urgent issues across multiple federal agencies. So we need a common infrastructure. We need a set of tools and data standards that the government can help establish to fulfill its vision. This does not exist today. The vision is sound. This FDS vision is sound, but we can't execute on this with the current infrastructure that we have.
And I guess I'll just ask maybe Congressman Khanna. I mean, data, of course, means a lot of different things. It's a lot of different types of data, formats of data. You know, the federal government is an extraordinarily complex place. You know, do you think the sort of complexity of the data combined with the complexity of the federal government, even when we have sort of some sort of infrastructure, does that complicate? You know, are there things we can do to sort of facilitate government entities and agencies working together, you know, in a collaborative way, given the kind of multidimensional complexity of that landscape?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a challenge beyond just data integration, and that is that there are a number of silos in the federal government where there's not cross cooperation. There's not an understanding on even how the same systems work. There's not a similar design. And there are programs within the federal government now, the Digital Core, presidential fellows, that are working on trying to better integrate and have better communication between different agencies that are tackling the same mission. But I think the complexity of integrating data is just one facet of the broader issue of how do we integrate systems that are not compatible in the federal government. It's amazing how one agency could be very different from another agency. It's not, there's not a standard around it.
Right, right. I'm sorry, please.
So John, if I can just pick up on that comment, that's a really important observation. This is the same challenge faced in the corporate world. You have silos of data everywhere, right? And what you need to do is assemble that and make it readily and quickly available in a very timely fashion to somebody who can actually use that to create some value or provide decisions and decision support. So it's the same problem. And what Congressman Khanna is pointing out is that you effectively leads you to the conclusion that you need some standardization of these systems, at least at the boundaries, at the interfaces, where they need to be communicating and sharing.
Right, thank you. And a few moments ago, Congressman Khanna, you quite rightly mentioned privacy as a really high priority concern among many consumers. And I think there can be at least some level of tension between, on the one hand, you know, the imperatives to protect privacy, and on the other hand, the imperatives to, you know, provide access to data. But obviously, we need to do that, provide that access to data without sacrificing privacy. And as many people are well aware, there's been quite a bit of this at the state level. There's privacy legislation. There has been places like California. There may be, you know, in other states as well. There's an active and ongoing dialogue at the federal level on privacy laws. And so, how do you see what are almost certainly going to be a fairly quickly evolving set of landscape changes involving privacy? How do you see that impacting the data infrastructure question? And this is a question for either or both of you, but I was sort of, you know, nudged towards it because Congressman Khanna brought up the consumer privacy issue, which is so important.
Well, I think a strong privacy regime is the first principle. I mean, until you have people trust the government with the use of data, there's always going to be a concern of giving government data. And I think the principle has to be that individuals own their data. They are they have a right to their data and that they ought to consent before giving their data, and they ought to know what's happening with their data. That is the principle behind some of the state privacy laws, and it's the principle behind the federal privacy law that's being worked upon.
So
there's a debate about how you enforce action or not, but I think it's absolutely imperative that we have strong data privacy at the front end of all of this.
So, you know, one of the problems with, and I completely agree with Congressman Khanna, this is critical. You have to be able to trust the use of your data. So this is necessary, and we have to put it in place. The EU led the charge with GDPR a few years ago, and to date, we have 17 other countries that have followed. The latest one actually being China. In the US, we don't have this at a national level. We have 3 states, California, Colorado, and Virginia. And what is happening in other states leads us to the potential of having 50 different privacy laws across the country. Just to comply with those laws is a challenge not only for companies, but it's going to be a challenge for the federal data strategy to say, how do I protect it and comply with all of these 50 variants of the laws? We really need a sort of blanket legislation at the federal level to cover this, much like Europe has done this and other countries have done this as well. 50 different flavors of privacy laws in the US alone just create a nightmare in terms of compliance.
And I'll add another one. I think Illinois has a biometric privacy law, right? So that's yet another kind of framework that applies, in one state, and perhaps, certainly not that particular law is only in Illinois. So yeah, that's a really interesting point. So I guess I also have a question about we talk about the public sector and the private sector, and we talk about them as if there's, the public sector, which is sort of one thing, and the private sector, which is one thing. But of course, the public sector is really complicated. And one thing, and I'd be interested in your thoughts, Congressman Khanna, if you were able to give us some of your ideas. I mean, the public sector not only includes this incredibly complex system, which we call the federal government, but of course, it's the state and local governments, which, as we saw in very stark form with everything that happened during COVID, really creates a complex data environment. And so, while on the one hand, having full respect for the rights of states and local jurisdictions to sort of, build their systems as they deem appropriate, subject to all the normal sort of regulations, are there some ideas you have about how we can facilitate sort of a coordination across that multi-layered complex system, which we call the public sector?
That's a great question. I mean, obviously, in a system of federalism, we have to respect some of the autonomy of state and local governments. But where there is coordination required, there could be at the federal standards of what is needed, where there are actual obligations that states and localities have to provide information to the federal government, and where it's not mandatory, there could be incentives that encourage common platforms, common design, and work with state and local governments and the federal government to implement systems that make that more possible and easier. And so you're right that there's multiple tracks. You have to first figure out how the federal agencies themselves communicate, and then how the federal agencies can communicate with state and local governments, and then how do you get data from the private sector coming in or nonprofit sector coming into the federal government. So it's a very complicated puzzle.
Buno, any thoughts on that?
No, I completely agree with that. That complexity has to be removed, is my view, that if we are sitting here with 50 different versions or flavors of privacy requirements, our ability to comply with that and create data, sort of a data infrastructure that can share data across agencies, across both government and private sector, is just not there.
So I mean, this makes me think about, I think, another aspect of this topic, which we haven't really touched on yet, which is cybersecurity, obviously of critical importance. I mean, on the one hand, I think having a kind of highly distributed system is maybe it impedes the kind of collaborative decision making and viewing of the data that can be beneficial. On the other hand, there's some inherent level of protection built in when you have a highly distributed system with a lot of different kind of subsystems, and so it becomes, because of that distributed nature, it arguably becomes a little more robust to cyber attacks. And so to the extent that we create sort of a more coherent, coordinated data infrastructure, does that raise cybersecurity concerns, either in the sense of having the data be hacked somehow or corrupted in a way that we didn't know was corrupted? And so any thoughts from Congressman Khanna or Buno on sort of how we might sort of weigh that issue as well as we sort of build this infrastructure?
Well, I think we want to make sure that our most sensitive technology and sensitive information isn't in a place where it can be a part of another data system. I mean, there are times where you have appropriately safeguarding information and data, and we need to have a proper encryption and protection of data. But there are other parts where that trade-off is worth having more integration and yet protection. I mean, there's obviously a trade-off to it, and it's something that has to be balanced on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, so John, I spent some time on this. I actually sit on the board of a cybersecurity company as well. But there's no level of protection that's absolute. It does not exist.
Right, of course, yes.
And whether this data exists in a distributed fashion or consolidated fashion, ultimately is not going to make that much of a difference. But what Congressman Khanna pointed out is there's different levels of security and there's trade-offs at each level as to the usability or utility of that data. As you lock things down more and more, it becomes inherently harder to use. Right. So there is a balance between that, but I see cybersecurity and sort of security as a whole as a blanket over anything that we do. That that's part of the trust that's placed in a system like this, that I'm going to put my data there. It's going to be protected, not only privacy from a privacy perspective, but from breaches that could be ultimately very harmful.
Okay, I'll just ask one more quick question, then we'll go to audience questions. So Congressman Khanna, you represent one of the most tech-focused districts in the United States, arguably perhaps the most tech-focused district. What can we, those of us in the policy community, do to kind of help increase awareness among members of Congress generally, not all of whom, represent areas as tech-focused as you do, to sort of just increase awareness about the importance of these data infrastructure questions and of engaging in the policy dialogue to address them?
Well, I think you're doing that. I think doing a forum.
This webinar, right?
Doing webinars, but I think members of Congress, I mean, I've suggested that they should come to Silicon Valley for a few-day orientation. I think it's critical that as tech issues are no longer niche issues, they're issues that affect everyday life, that Congress people have basic understanding. You don't have to understand the details of computer science, but if you want to make rules for how you drive on a road, you probably want to have driven or been in a passenger seat at least. And so I think it's more about making sure members of Congress have the basic experiential knowledge and that they're capable of then bringing their values to make informed decisions.
Well, thank you very much. So, okay, let me turn to some audience questions here. So, in a highly polarized time, my impression, and maybe I'm wrong, is that this kind of thing is refreshingly nonpartisan, right? And I guess the question for Congressman Khanna is, who is, of course, in a far better position than I am to know about these things. Do you think that there's bipartisan support for addressing these kind of challenges? And if so, how do you see a path through Congress on this?
I do, although even the data privacy law, unfortunately, has gotten caught up in partisanship. So, the the Republicans want to preempt all the state laws. The Democrats are saying preempt the state laws, but allow state laws that have higher privacy to still have some room. There's a debate on how to enforce it. Should there be a private cause of action or not? So theoretically, this is an area that we could have commitment to work across the aisle. But the devil is always in the details. And sometimes those things become hard to sort out. But in terms of a sense of let's improve our data infrastructure in this country and figure out how do we do that without violating privacy or security, I think you'd get a lot of people saying yes to that.
Buno, any thoughts from your side? You're very engaged in these policy questions as well.
Well, I'm less engaged in the policy questions and more engaged in the how do you solve these problems type of.
But that means you're engaged in the policy questions if you're helping figure out how to solve them. So
yeah, no, look, I view this as important, that data infrastructure, as important as the internet infrastructure that we established a few decades ago, right? And that took the government, that took private sector, all working together to ultimately establish the right rules, regulations, standards, everything that was needed to put this all together. I would certainly assign that level of importance to a data infrastructure in this day and age.
I see. Okay. So another audience question we have is, clearly, the data challenges are global in scope, and we're not the only country facing, the need to build a better data infrastructure. And I guess the question is are we seeing any other examples in other jurisdictions that can sort of provide an illustration of maybe things that we can learn from that might be working that we might want to adopt here, or by contrast, things that maybe aren't working so well and we want to steer clear of? Is there any clear kind of, looking outward beyond the United States, any clear takeaways we can get by looking at that landscape in relation to this data infrastructure question?
So just a few notes there. First of all, I think we can learn from the unity of the EU in terms of privacy laws and privacy regulations. GDPR is a very strict set of rules and with very severe penalties at the corporate level for violation of those rules in protection of individuals' data privacy. From that, we can certainly learn. There are bits and pieces of infrastructure in other countries, and without naming it all, that actually proved much more effective in getting the data quickly to people who needed it for use in responding to the pandemic. So we could do better. We could learn from these other countries, but I think there are certain unique elements to what we have here and that we need to address as separately.
Right. I guess one obvious kind of piece of information for contextualizing is what might work in a country of 3 million people, right?
Exactly.
I mean, Estonia is famously forward-looking in terms of data, and without in any way discounting the extraordinary efforts they've put in, it's a much smaller population, right? It's so what you can do in a country like Estonia is maybe harder to emulate or replicate in a country as complex and large as the United States.
Right.
So okay. So another question is, are we learning anything in the private sector that can be applied to the public sector? In other words, I think as we all know, of course, there's a vast amount of data that's collected and stored and processed and exchanged in the private sector, not only through the social media companies that we're all familiar with, but some of the companies that are sort of at the kind of behind the scenes and so on. Does that provide us some learnings that can help instruct us at the federal government level how we might engage with enormous amounts of complex data with various ways, structured in many different ways, with privacy concerns and so on?
So I think that we can learn a tremendous amount. The problems that let's put aside the companies that were built around data, such as Google and so forth. The older companies have exactly the same problems, certainly at a different scale, as we have as a country, or the federal government would have in establishing a data strategy. So there is a tremendous amount to be learned. And for one, it is a very complex task. There are many companies that have tried and failed and turned around and tried again to implement modernized data strategies. And that is where all the learnings lie right now.
And Congressman Khanna, I think you were about to say something when Buno started speaking.
Yes, and then John, I've got to run, but I really have enjoyed this. And let me say this: I think it's so important that we get more of the private sector talent into the federal government and understanding the challenges of building data infrastructure, also understanding how to best enforce regulations. One of the challenges with GDPR is that the tech companies run circles around them with dark patterns and find the lowest forums, least enforcement forums. So, I think Europe's misguided to think that they can innovate on policy without innovating on technology. I think it's ultimately going to require technologists to be able to regulate them as well. And that's why I think American leadership matters, and having technologists in our government matter. I definitely think we need a collaboration with the private sector in these ideas. But I appreciate very much the conversation and look forward to much more engagement and your insights on how we move forward.
Okay, and it sounds like Congressman Khanna, you've probably got to run to your next commitment. Then any other quick closing comments you want to offer before we move on?
I would
general
this
comments.
is an area that I would just say this is an area that the private sector policy experts, other leaders can have an impact on, because it's so unformed. It's not a place where there's a lot of conventional ideology or orthodoxies, and that means your insights, your opinions can help shape us to get us in the right direction.
Okay, well, thank you, Congressman Khanna.
Thank you.
Very much appreciate your time. And Buno, I want to close with you, if you have any a minute or so of closing thoughts on the topic generally, not necessarily specific to any one of the particular questions that we engaged with.
Well, on the topic generally, national data infrastructure, I think it's must have. It's not going to happen without support, incentives, leadership from the government. And I was happy to hear Congressman Khanna's statement that this will garner bipartisan support, these ideas and concepts. And the value of it is probably very well understood at this point. So just as a closing comment, I think the couple of things that can be done almost immediately is it can be prioritized higher than it is today. It can be funded in a way that is stronger than it is today. I was reading a report from the 2020 progress of the federal data strategy, and one of the things they're struggling with is funding, budget, right? The average CDO, chief data officer of these agencies, 50% of them reported that they have less than 10 people supporting. Well, that's not going to result in any great infrastructure being built, right? So that it has to be prioritized, it has to be funded. And I was very happy to hear that there is indeed the likelihood of bipartisan support for this type of thing.
Well, thank you, Buno, and we're very appreciative that you and Congressman Khanna were able to join us today for a really interesting conversation on a topic that's certainly not going away. You can learn more about this series at hoover.org/capital conversations. And I'd like to express my thanks and my thanks, I'm sure, on behalf of our panelists. Thank you for joining us today. And I hope you'll tune in on Thursday, May 26th at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, for a conversation between Hoover Director Condoleezza Rice and Senator Dan Sullivan. Thank you very much.